I've no fortune, but I'm feeling over with affections which I'm ready to pour out all over you, like applesauce over roast pork.
Mr. Trenchard, you will please recollect you are addressing my daughter, and in my presence...
Yes, I'm offering her my heart and hand as she wants them with nothing in them.
Augusta dear, to your room. I am aware, Mr. Trenchard, you are not used to the manners of good society, and that alone will excuse the impertinence of which you have been guilty.
Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dologizing old man-trap.
On April 14th, 1865, the Confederate supporter and well-known actor John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln while he was attending a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington. That is the full description of the Lincoln Assassination, as it appears on page 410 of the textbook U.S. History, provided by the free service OpenStax. Its brevity is common for textbooks, although some will add a bit of context about Booth's history as a Southern sympathizer, or the 12-day manhunt that led to Booth's own death. But the focus, in any case, was on the participants of the event, Lincoln and Booth. After it serves its purpose as the location where the assassination took place, Ford's Theater tends to fall out of the historical record, the venue and the play Lincoln was watching becoming footnotes. Something for Jeopardy contestants to remember.
$13,000!
So would you believe the theater still exists today? If you go to 511 East 10th Street in Washington, D.C., next door to the Hard Rock Cafe and across the street from Lincoln's Waffle Shop, you'll find Ford's Theater, a regional theater company that produces a 4-play main stage season with a basement museum where the gun that killed Abraham Lincoln is on display. But how do you transition from being a site of national mourning to a theater company where Come From Away played their pre-Broadway run? What is Ford's Theater attempting to be? This is the first of a 2-part series discussing the history and meaning of Ford's Theater. Part 1 will discuss how the theater became what it is today, while Part 2 will look at what it became. Because Ford's Theater is much more than a footnote, it's part of the ongoing conversation on how we honor our history and how theater can help to shape the future. Let's return to that one-sentence summary of the Lincoln assassination. There's a lot of details needing clarification there, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on 3 of them: the venue, the assassination, and the play. Ford's Theater gets its name from John T. Ford, a producer who converted Washington, D.C.'s First Baptist Church building into a theater in 1862. While Ford was based in Baltimore, Ford's Athenaeum, as the building would be called, was one of several houses he owned and operated around the country. The venue did not self-produce, but hosted artists and troops that were touring through DC. Sometimes these were full productions that treated Ford's like a venue, but most of the time the visiting artists would be one notable actor, like Edwin Forrest or Alice Gray. Ford employed a stock company of actors who would quickly learn the lines for a given play, filling out the cast and supporting the star performer before rinsing and repeating for whatever was performing next week. After a successful debut performance of John Thomas Haynes' military drama The French Spy on March 19, 1862, Ford's Athenaeum enjoyed a successful run in DC, including a concert on May 28th, attended by President Abraham Lincoln. However, after 9 months, a gas fire in the basement led to the building burning down. Ford was undeterred, however, using the fire as an opportunity to rebuild the former church into a proper auditorium. After a rapid construction period, the renamed Ford's New Theater opened on August 27, 1863, with William E. Burton's musical drama, The Naiad Queen. Some viewers may note that this means Ford's New Theater had been in operation for less than 2 years by the time Abraham Lincoln was killed there in April 1865. However, in that brief time, Lincoln had certainly become familiar with the venue. Lincoln was one of the greatest patrons of the arts to ever lead the country, attending more than 40 theatrical performances in DC during his 4-year presidency. That included 10 visits to Ford's, 3 concerts and 7 plays, where he watched Edwin Forrest as King Lear, Maggie Mitchell in Fanshawe the Cricket, and, most historically fascinating, a November 9th, 1863 performance of The Marble Heart, starring that eminent tragedian, John Wilkes Booth. It's apparently a common misconception that Booth was performing in Our American Cousin on the night of the assassination, but that's not true. Despite his considerable fame, Booth gave only 13 performances at Ford's New Theater, a 2-week booking in November 1863 where a different play was performed each of the 12 nights, and 1 additional performance of The Apostate in March 1865. The Marble Heart was the only time Lincoln ever watched Booth perform at Ford's, 18 months before the two would meet at the theater again. When Booth arrived at Ford's on April 14, 1865, he wasn't on the bill and he didn't even have a ticket. He was a well enough performer that they simply let him walk in. Now let's talk about what was on the bill. Our American Cousin, a comedy of manners from English writer Tom Taylor, was popular enough by 1865 that it had already played at Ford's New Theater on 7 separate occasions, as different visiting artists had the script in their repertoire. But the actress performing it at Ford's on the night Lincoln was shot wasn't just any artist. She was from the original cast. Laura Keene was an English actress, playwright, and theater manager who had made her name in New York City, working with a regular staple of actors at her own venue, Laura Keene's Theater. Their greatest success by far had been the 1858 world premiere of Our American Cousin, which had blown through its initial 2-week run to a then unprecedented 150 performances. The original cast included Keene as the aristocrat Florence Trenchard and Joseph Jefferson as brash American Asa Trenchard. And yes, Chicago theater artists, that Joseph Jefferson. While Keene herself would be the only member of the original cast coming to Ford's, she brought 2 additional performers, Harry Hawk and John Dyott, who had experience performing with her company. The rest of the cast would be, naturally, Ford's stock performers. But importantly, Keene and Co. were not booked into Ford's to perform Our American Cousin. They were there to promote a newer play, The Workmen of Washington, a pro-temperance play written by Keene herself. It had premiered in New York as The Workmen of New York, but Keene adapted it slightly for every city it performed in. Ford booked the trio from April 3rd to April 8th, giving 6 performances to rapt audiences. In fact, they did so well that Ford would hold them over for a second week. That week would culminate with a benefit performance, a special evening where the theater manager agrees to give 100% of the box office receipts to the star performer, as opposed to the agreed-upon split. John Wilkes Booth's March 1865 performance of The Apostate had been a benefit performance for the actor John McCullough, while the April 14th performance at Ford's would be a benefit for Laura Keene. But what the benefit performance would actually entail wasn't known to the public in advance. The week of April 10th saw Keene, Hawk, and Dyott performing different pieces from their repertoire each night, often announcing one show a day in advance and changing their mind the next morning. By the time that the April 14th performance was announced as Our American Cousin, the president and his wife had already decided to attend. Lincoln had seen the play before, but it hardly mattered. The real draw was Laura Keene, on the final night of her successful 2-week run in Washington. It would be, all were sure, a night to remember. And it was.
For God's sake, have presence of mind and keep your places, and all will be well.
If there's a person to feel sorry for in the Lincoln assassination, aside from Lincoln himself, his wife, his children, the cabinet, all former slaves, and the country at large, spare a thought for actress Jenny Gourdet. A member of Ford's stock acting company, she was preparing for her own benefit performance to take place on April 15th, the day after the assassination. It was canceled. The day after Lincoln died, Keene, Hawk, and Dyott were taken in for questioning on suspicion of being part of the conspiracy. They were released 2 days later. While Laura Keene's theater did continue to stage the play, eventually bringing it back to DC in 1869, Laura Keene herself never performed Our American Cousin again. Meanwhile, John T. Ford was in Baltimore when the assassination occurred, and returned to Washington the following morning to find the theater seized by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Ford was also brought in on suspicion of conspiracy, but unlike the actors, he remained a suspect for over a month, finally being cleared on May 31st. In that time, a robust debate had been brewing in Washington about what to do with Ford's new theater. Some suggested it could return to performances, others suggested turning it into a Lincoln monument of some kind, and still others proposed, or threatened, to burn it down immediately. In the end, though, there were really only two perspectives on what to do with Ford's new theater that actually mattered. The first was John T. Ford himself, who planned to get back to performances as soon as the government vacated the building, which they did on June 22nd. The four conspirators of the Lincoln Assassination were sentenced to hang on July 7th, so Ford announced that his theater would be reopening on July 10th. Over 200 tickets were sold, but audience members who came to the theater that night found a sign on the door reading, "Closed by order of the War Department." As it turns out, the only other person whose perspective on what to do with Ford's mattered was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Stanton was so fundamentally against further performances at Ford's that he ordered 30 soldiers to surround the theater, essentially seizing it without charge, in defiance of the cabinet members who had approved its reopening. Not that he was alone in this. A writer at the New York Herald called the attempted reopening a violation of the public's sense of propriety, an attempt to coin the blood of a great man. Is that straight? Well, now I'm official. After John T. Ford threatened to sue the government for depriving him of his means of income, Congress agreed to pay Ford a monthly rent of $1,500 with an option to purchase the theater outright when appropriations could be made for it. And they were, with Congress allocating $100,000 in April 1866 for the purchase of the property in Washington City known as Ford's Theater, for the deposit and safekeeping of documentary papers relating to the soldiers of the Army of the United States, and to the Museum of the Medical and Surgical Department of the Army. This hinted at the government's future plans for Ford's new theater, as did the fact that, despite the rental agreement including the promise that the government would return the building to him in its original form, construction began as early as August 1865 to convert the theater into an office building. The interior was demolished and a fireproof 3-story building was constructed, opening in 1867 with the U.S. Pensions Office occupying the bottom 2 floors and the Army Surgical Museum on the 3rd. To Stanton, this was the most fitting use of the building.
One of the most striking features of the character of the late president was his deep sympathy for the sick and wounded. There would seem to be no more fitting purpose to which the building could be applied than to have the spot hallowed by his blood consecrated to the preservation of those who, like himself, suffered as martyrs in the national cause.
The office retained the name Ford's New Building, but for all practical purposes, 1 year after the assassination, the theater was gone. But this is a video essay channel about theater history. So, with your forgiveness, we're now going to skim over about 97 years of history, in which generation after generation continue to have no idea what to do with Ford's Theater. And to tell that story, we have to move across the street. Up to now, I haven't mentioned the Peterson House, the location across the street where Lincoln was carried after the assassination, also known officially as the house where Lincoln died. The Ford's Theater National Historic Site, established in 1932, includes both Ford's and the Peterson House, and the two have evolved in tandem over the last 150 years. Most notably, in 1893, two important things happened. A collapse of the 3rd floor at Ford's new building, resulting in 22 deaths and the building's conversion into a warehouse, and the opening of the Oldroyd Collection, an assemblage of hundreds of random bits of Lincolniana owned by collector Osgood Oldroyd, which the Peterson House agreed to display. In 1932, just as the National Historic Site was being established, the Oldroyd Collection was transferred across the street, where Ford's new building was being converted into the Lincoln Museum. The following year, management of the two buildings was transferred to the National Park Service, which remains in charge today. The Lincoln Museum was a disjointed affair, partially owing to the fact that Oldroyd had failed to catalog any of the collection before his death in 1930, leaving the museum to sort through more than 3,000 objects to determine what was actually relevant to display. Importantly, the original curators of the Lincoln Museum took pains to intentionally de-emphasize the assassination, focusing instead on Lincoln's life and career. A painted spot on the ground indicated where in the building the assassination had taken place, and a model of the theater interior was available, but besides that, visitors intending to see the location where Lincoln was shot found the building generally lacking. As the Lincoln Museum evolved, and as living memory of the assassination faded away, there were growing calls to see Ford's theater restored to its appearance on the night of April 14th. One of the loudest voices calling for the restoration was North Dakota Senator Milton R. Young, who introduced joint resolutions in Congress in 1946, 1954, and 1960, all instructing the Department of the Interior, which runs the National Park Service, to estimate the cost of restoring Ford's theater. Staff at the department were initially against the restoration, but as time went on and interest in the Lincoln assassination grew, the content of reports from that time began to indicate a growing shift in favor of the restoration. The NPS published their Historic Structures Report in 1963, their first formal plan for how a restoration would be carried out, if it were approved. Importantly, the original blueprints for Ford's new theater were lost, but the discovery of John T. Ford's sketches for the building and photographer Matthew Brady's post-assassination photographs of the interior had made it possible to craft new blueprints that reasonably approximated the original design. After the death of John F. Kennedy later that year led to a burst of public interest in the Lincoln assassination, and a fresh wave of guests to the slowly decaying Lincoln Museum, a restoration looked more and more likely. This culminated in July 1964, when Congress allocated $2.073 million in funding to restore Ford's theater to the way it looked on the night Lincoln was shot. And on November 29, 1964, Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall ordered the Lincoln Museum closed for good. Which is where this story, finally, becomes about theater again.
Ford's Theater is a historic structure that memorializes one of the darkest moments in American history, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Since history is a blend of glory, triumph, failure, and tragedy, the restoration of Ford's Theater as a memorial within the National Parks system is appropriate.
The original plans, approved in 1964, would include a full restoration of Ford's Theater above ground, with the old Royd collection relocating to a new museum in the basement of the building. Unlike the Lincoln Museum, the revised Ford's Theater would focus on both Lincoln's presidency as well as the assassination itself, finally displaying Booth's Derringer pistol used to shoot Lincoln, which had been in NPS holdings since 1932, but only displayed for a brief stretch in 1940. Guests would visit the museum first, then walk upstairs to the theater space, which would be decked out exactly as it looked in 1865, including a reconstructed version of the set for Our American Cousin on the stage. All of this was moving forward in accordance with Secretary Udall's plans when, in June 1965, he and his assistant attended a Broadway show and ran into two old friends. One was Don Hewitt, a television producer best known for creating 60 Minutes, and the other was Don's wife, Frankie Childers Hewitt, and it was Frankie that Udall knew better. Frankie Hewitt had spent the 1950s as a Washington lobbyist, meeting Udall during her time working on the Senate Juvenile Delinquency Committee. She later joined the staff of UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, and after stepping back from politics in 1963, had remained a significant figure in New York, a powerful socialite and fundraiser with connections to the boards at many arts organizations. Udall glowingly explained his plans for the reconstruction of Ford's Theater during intermission, to which Hewitt asked whether plays would still be performed there. She then continued asking that question all night, long after the four had retired to Sardi's after the show, until Udall began to seriously consider the proposition. To Hewitt, a reconstructed Ford's that didn't produce plays wouldn't be a monument to Lincoln, it would be a monument to Booth.
Ford's could have been restored simply as a mute monument to a slain hero. But I felt it was important to move beyond the tragedy, to reclaim the theater as a national treasure, to transform it into a celebration of America's cultural heritage.
Now, Hewitt was not the first person to ask about plays at Ford's. The president of Actors Equity, Frederick O'Neill, had written to Udall around the same time, and Equity would later consult with the NPS on the revised blueprints for Ford's to find the best compromise between historical accuracy and modern safety requirements for theaters. But Hewitt was the founder of the nonprofit Ford's Theater Society, which would handle programming. and she's the one with the plaque in the theater lobby dedicated to her. Which isn't entirely accurate, by the way. Ford's Theater Society gave its first performances in 1968, but the nonprofit was chartered in 1967. I know that's incredibly granular, but you know. Ford's Theater Society entered an agreement with the National Park Service for exclusive use of the building from the fall to spring period with the following language regarding programming. The FTS was to produce and present to the public live theater and or other programs or presentations which have a relationship to Abraham Lincoln, to theater presentations of his period, or to the ideals which he represents. Under Hewitt, Ford's would once again become a roadhouse, inviting outside companies to be resident at Ford's for a season or two at a time. The initial season would be performed by the National Repertory Theater, a New York-based company whose artistic director, Michael Dewell, had been another public voice arguing in support of theater at Ford's. The resident company, the creatively named NRT at Ford's, announced its initial 14-week season in November 1967 to begin performances the following February. Stephen Vincent Benet's John Brown's Body, adapted for the stage by Jack J. Sydow, Shakespeare's The Comedy of Errors, and Oliver Goldsmith's She Stoops to Conquer. The latter two plays had been performed at Ford's New Theater in the 1860s, while John Brown's Body was a 1928 poem about the Civil War. While a limited number of subscriptions were sold, nearly a third of the 700-seat house was held for student tickets. According to Michael Dewell, the company should be enormously oriented to youth. We want to give young people a sense of the American past. When asked whether the venture could be profitable with a mid-sized house and a short season, Dewell replied, "Can we make ends meet? Not a prayer, but we aren't looking for government subsidy. We feel the private sector should support us, and I think it will." Which, doesn't sound at all like tempting fate. There are 3 days in 1968 that can claim to be the date that Ford's Theater returned to Washington, depending on how you define return. A private dedication ceremony was hosted by Vice President Hubert Humphrey on January 21st. A formal gala, televised by CBS, took place on January 30th. And finally, there was the opening night of NRT at Ford's season on February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, when the general public first got to see the reconstructed theater and marvel at how truly uncomfortable the uncushioned, cane-bottomed chairs were. Seriously, this comes up a lot in reporting on the opening of Ford's Theater. The NPS was unwilling to budge on historical accuracy when it came to the chairs, so for the first year of operation, they were constantly fielding complaints about how uncomfortable they were. They eventually relented in 1969 and added cushions, but it would be another 20 years until the chair design was overhauled in favor of something ahistoric but much more comfortable. But getting back to those 3 opening nights, the gala on January 30th was the most frequently reported in the media, with performances from Helena Hayes, Harry Belafonte, Odetta, Henry Fonda, and soprano Patricia Brooks, the only performance I could find footage of. In a quirk of historical timing, President Lyndon Johnson was scheduled to attend the gala, the first president to enter the building since Lincoln, but earlier that day, the American embassy in Saigon had been attacked by Viet Cong operatives, so he had more pressing matters to attend to, which didn't stop a large crowd of protesters from gathering outside the theater anyway. For my money, however, the performance of John Brown's Body on February 12th feels like the moment when Ford's took a turn towards no longer just being a site of mourning. Yes, there were performances during the gala, but they were rooted in Lincoln's speeches and his favorite works of art. And yes, John Brown's Body dealt with Lincoln's time period, but it was a performance framed by the space, not simply referential to it. It was the first time since Our American Cousin that an audience had come to the building on 10th Street not just to honor Lincoln, but to attend a play, the thing Frankie Hewitt had been pushing for since that New York meeting in 1965. Or at least it was a version of what Hewitt had been pushing for. By her own admission, Hewitt didn't know, quote, tiddly damn about the theater, and wanted plays at Ford's more on principle than because she had any sort of artistic vision. Because, as far as I can tell, Ford's Theater is one of the only theater companies ever formed by somebody with more experience running a board of directors than running a rehearsal room. Which, it turns out, affects how you define whether the company is succeeding. In June 1968, about a month after She Stoops to Conquer closed, news broke that Ford's Theater Society was severing ties with the NRT, citing losses of $50,000 after a 14-week season that played to 90% capacity. Duell, who was furious that a planned 3-year contract had been cut short, blamed Hewitt for failing to meet her fundraising goals, while Hewitt claimed that repertory theater was a losing proposition no matter the quality of the work. It's worth pointing out at this point that when Ford's Theater Society put out the call for resident companies in August 1967, NRT was one of only 2 companies to apply for the position, with most estimating that making a profit in the 700-seat theater was going to be extremely difficult, before you even factor in those student tickets. The decision to cut ties after such a short season was widely seen as a bad move, voiced most powerfully by Toronto Star theater critic Sidney Johnson. In a July 1968 article summarizing the breakup, she made the following observations, which, despite their length, I'm including here in full, so buckle up.
Hewitt said that the season proved that it is economically unrealistic to try and permanently support a large repertory troupe in a 742-seat house. It is statements like this from the executive heads of artistic committees on the North American continent that make one despair of culture ever taking root in our society as it has in Europe. After a 15-week season of 3 plays, this lady, whoever she is, has reached this staggering economic conclusion. Does she not know the seating capacity of theaters housing permanent repertory companies throughout the world? Cutting through this reported tangle of accusations, denials, and counter-accusations, the situation boils down to still another beautifully appointed theater presumably erected or constructed for cultural purposes, with nothing to put into it. In this case, the cultural vacuum is magnified by the theater project being a well-publicized national memorial dedicated to a much-revered president who was an avid theater-goer and a keen Shakespearean student. Ford's Theater seems to be following the pattern set by the Repertory Company of New York's Lincoln Center, which, after hiring and firing directors and producers, has, like the larger state theater in the same center, been accused of turning itself into a Broadway commercial house.
Yeah, about that. On November 7th, news broke that Zev Buffman, Broadway producer and owner of the Coconut Grove Playhouse in Miami, was the frontrunner to take over as artistic director at Ford's. Reached for comment ahead of his expected hiring, he stated that he hoped to run Ford's at a profit, raising prices and increasing the seating capacity, and shared 2 of the plays he hoped to program: Your Own Thing, a rock musical based on Twelfth Night, and Big Time Buck White, an off-Broadway comedy about the Black Panther movement. I should put it in context that these statements were made the same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and 2 days after Richard Nixon was elected president, and the plan was to stage a comedy about the Black Panther movement in the theater where Lincoln was shot. Zev Buffman did not end up becoming the artistic director of Ford's. Although admittedly that had less to do with his business plans and more to do with Ford's Theater Society being sued by the National Repertory Theater for $141,000 for breach of contract, on the day before Buffman's appointment was to be announced. Despite all this chaos and the fact that Ford's had now been dark for longer than it had been back post-renovation, December brought news of a new resident company at Ford's, New York's Circle in the Square. Yes, another repertory group, but the revised contract included concessions from both Ford's Theater Society and the National Park Service. For the FTS, they tweaked ticket prices and fundraising commitments to assure that the theater needed only 75% capacity to break even. And for the NPS, they agreed to a shift in Ford's Theater Society's mission that committed the company as a home for American playwrights, giving the company a loophole to produce more popular work than the classical pieces staged by the NRT. And there were more popular pieces. In the 3 years that Circle in the Square was resident at Ford's, they staged Ah Wilderness, The Fantastics, Arsenic and Old Lace, You're a Good Man Charlie Brown, and Will Rogers USA, the beginning of a long association between Ford's and solo performer James Whitmore. However, by 1971, Hewitt had once again decided that the repertory model wasn't financially stable and cut ties with Circle in the Square, leading to another lawsuit. However, while the NRT lawsuit ended in 1976 with the FTS agreeing to pay $40,000, the Circle lawsuit was settled out of court in 1972. Lucky for them, however, Circle was about to move into their new purpose-built space in New York, which bears their name today. At this point, the FTS had staged 4 seasons, burned bridges with 2 nonprofit theater companies, and fundamentally blown up their original agreement to stage plays about Lincoln or his time period. So when Frankie Hewitt announced her intention to step down from the board of the FTS and take on a new position as executive producer as Ford's began producing its own work in-house, there were really 2 ways this could have gone. In one timeline, Hewitt's position as a theatrical neophyte with more experience in fundraising than season selection is what finally tanks the nonprofit, and Ford's reverts to being a static museum piece, as Udall originally intended it to be. In the other timeline, Hewitt's first scheduled production is Mickey Grant's Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope, a world premiere musical review of Black Life, which did record box office numbers at Ford's, transferred to Broadway the following April, and was nominated for 4 Tony Awards. So maybe Hewitt had some idea what she was doing. To be clear, the revised contract with Circle in the Square did not completely erase Lincoln from the mission of Ford's Theater Society. It would be hard to do that in a building literally reconstructed to honor him. But it did shift the mission into one that saw the Lincoln legacy as less concrete and more open to interpretation. Lincoln, as signer of the Emancipation Proclamation, has an undeniable place in Black American history, for good or ill. Don't Bother Me and its spiritual follow-up, Your Arms Too Short to Box with God, which debuted at Ford's in 1975 and also transferred to Broadway, both had a natural place among the programming at Ford's Theater. As to how the Lincoln legacy was honored by the musical Godspell, which played an 18-month open run from 1972 to 73, Hewitt's explanation can be a bit squirrely.
In the spring, we get a lot of young people and visitors to Washington. We have a Black audience, which we reach through the Black church groups. Our audience is more popular-oriented than, say, Arena. We are consciously reaching out to a new audience and to the young with shows like Godspell and Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Oh yeah, they did Joseph in 1980. The story of Hewitt's tenure as executive producer from 1971 up to her passing in 2003 is marked by this slow expansion of Ford's theater into bolder and more modern programming, often to the chagrin of more historically minded observers. I'll talk more at length in part 2 about the equivocation around mission statements, but to give us some greater context for what Ford's theater became in the 21st century, let's discuss some trends for how it navigated the 20th. As Hewitt alluded to, Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope was the start of a long association between Ford's theater and the Black arts movement nationally, and the Black theater going public in DC locally. Circle in the Square had kicked things off with Trumpets of the Lord, a 1969 piece fusing together Black sermons with gospel music, which was followed by Me and Bessie in 1974, I Have a Dream in 1976, Langston Hughes' Black Nativity in 1981, A Soldier's Play in 1983, and many more. From the National Park Service's Administrative History of Ford's.
Riding the wave of Black theater appearing in American cities in the 1970s, Hewitt wanted Ford's Theater as a National Historic Site, carrying forward Lincoln's values, to be a theater for all Americans. However, she and other urban theater owners of the time were also aware of the financial success of Black shows. After the 1968 riots, suburban whites became reluctant to venture into the city at night. However, the increasingly Black urban population provided a ready audience, particularly for plays and performances that reflected their own lives. FTS staff regularly conducted outreach to the Black community, inviting church and community leaders to premieres and hoping for word-of-mouth publicity. In cultivating a diverse program and diverse audiences, Hewitt helped incorporate Ford's theater into the cultural fabric of the city.
That said, a significant portion of attendees to Ford's are tourists, interested in Lincoln, yes, as well as American history more broadly. Hewitt found the best method of playing to this crowd while also keeping production costs low: solo performances based on historical figures. James Whitmore, as mentioned previously, kicked off this trend with Will Rogers USA, a show he would bring back to Ford's 7 more times, but was also responsible for Give 'em Hell, Harry, a 1975 solo play about President Harry Truman that became not only an enormous success for Ford's, but also broke the curse of no sitting president attending a play at Ford's, the president in question being, appropriately, Gerald Ford. Historical figure solo performances included David Wayne as H.L. Mencken, Hal Holbrook as Mark Twain, Eileen Heckert as Eleanor Roosevelt, Vincent Price as Oscar Wilde, Louis J. Stadlin as Groucho Marx, Tom Taylor as Woody Guthrie, and that's just from 1972 to 79. Two of the shows mentioned before, Me and Bessie and I Have a Dream, had larger casts but were spiritually similar, featuring respectively Linda Hopkins as Bessie Smith and Billy D. Williams as MLK Jr. Abraham Lincoln himself remained offstage until 1980, when the Canadian solo play Mr. Lincoln transferred to Ford's, starring Roy Dotrice as the president. But when Ford's did have reliable funding, it turned into an unexpectedly robust venue for new musicals. During the first 22 years of Hewitt's tenure, Ford's premiered 20 world premiere musicals, some of which were commissions, many of which went on to longer lives on Broadway or in licensing. Of particular note is Ford's 1986 premiere of Hot Mikado, a jazz-infused rewrite of the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta that would return to Ford's twice, in 1994 and 2002. And that's not even counting the various second productions of new musicals that also found continued life at Ford's: Sheila's Day, God's Trombones, The Robber Bridegroom, and, most relevant for longtime viewers of this channel, both Nonsense and Nonsense 2. If there's a single show that best represents what Ford's Theatre had become under Hewitt, it would probably be the 1979 premiere of Storyville, a commissioned world premiere musical about the history of New Orleans jazz, with an all-black cast engaging with American history in a lively and uplifting way, which is exactly what Hewitt ended up aiming for.
Our philosophy is to do the kind of programming that is based on the American experience, with characters and events out of history. This theater, for example, is the perfect place for jazz, gospel, folk music. I never want to turn the theater into something that it is not true to.
So, in brief, despite everything, that is what Hewitt had shaped Ford's Theatre into by the time she passed in 2003. A moderately daring, historically minded regional theater company honoring the legacy of Lincoln by keeping alive the uplifting performance tradition he loved. Heading into the 21st century, with the Lincoln Bicentennial and the Civil War Sesquicentennial on the horizon, Ford's Theatre had an identity of its own, beyond the museum in the basement and the box at stage left. Far from a static monument to the assassination, the theater is in a dynamic engagement with history. But the ways in which Ford's Theatre engages with history and how they frame their programming as educational has shifted from Hewitt's tenure to now. The public perception of Abraham Lincoln is more complicated than simply knowing him as the great emancipator, and the question of how best to honor him, on stage or otherwise, is a question Ford's Theatre is constantly asking itself. How can a theater explore the legacy of a politician? What role does Lincoln serve for us today? And how is his legacy honored by a production of Godspell? See you in part 2.